Does the NHL schedule matter when it comes to a team's chances to win games? Let's analyze the variables of days off, hours off, and distance traveled for each team heading into every game since 2013. Starting with days off, when one team had more days off than their opponent, that team won 54% of the time. This makes sense because rest allows players to recover from the tight 82-game schedule, and can be a huge advantage if the opponent didn't get that same benefit. But the number of more days off one team had over their opponent was not that significant, as teams had a very similar win rate whether they had 1, 2, or 3 more days off than their opponent. And rust may even start to be a factor if a team has too many days off. But what is a huge factor is if one team has 0 days off and the other team has rest. Whether the rested team has 1, 2, or 3 days off, they win a whopping 57.6% of the time in these scenarios. In other words, if a team is playing their second game of a back-to-back and their opponent has rest, they lose 57.6% of the time. But since 2013-2014, almost half of all games involve two teams with the same number of days off, which does impact the practicality of the days off variable. So maybe hours off can fix this problem. Hours off is similar to days off, but it's more applicable since it now accounts for the time of day each team plays, which decreases the number of games that have to be discarded because both teams had the same amount of rest. However, a vital flaw with this variable is that it doesn't provide anything useful that days off didn't already provide. In fact, hours off even ends up overfitting and becomes counterintuitive. For example, if a team with 50 hours off plays a team with 48 hours off, any results from that game is very unlikely to do with rest, since a 2-hour difference over a 2-day span is negligible. The only useful application for hours off is if two games are both playing their second game of a back-to-back, and their previous game the day before started at different times. The good thing about distance traveled is that almost every game has two teams coming in with different distances traveled. The main exception is when two teams play each other in back-to-back games. But overall, this variable simply isn't that useful on its own. The only scenario where it theoretically could be useful is if one team had to travel and the other didn't. But by technicality, that must mean that the non-traveling team is playing their second game at home, which means home ice advantage becomes a massive confounding variable. That's why it's better to combine distance traveled with days off, where you can see having the advantage in both directions pushes the win rate up, and having the disadvantage of both less days off and more distance traveled pushes the win rate down. As a result, days off is the most significant of the schedule variables. But the fact that day off scenarios can only be applied to slightly over half of games is a bit inconvenient. Both hours off and distance traveled are too flawed to use on their own, but combining days off with distance traveled does provide useful information. If this topic interests you and you want to read the full article, then be sure to check out the articles page at slapshotbets.com.